In 1948, a South African novelist wrote, "Cry the beloved country for the unborn child that is the inheritor of our fear. Let him not love the earth too deeply, for fear will rob him of all if he gives too much." You see, he was mourning the state of his country under the savage policy of apartheid. Black people were unable to move freely outside of their own designated homelands, which consisted of crowded shanty towns strangled by poverty and by police intimidation. Resistance was met with brutality. Nelson Mandela, a charismatic leader in the fight to end apartheid, was sentenced to life in prison in 1964. Nearly 600 unarmed protesters were slain during the 1976 demonstration in Soweto. Stephen Biko, their leader, was beaten by the police and died in their custody. Horrified governments around the world launched a boycott in the 1980s that crippled the South African economy. Shortly after his election in 1990, President F.W. de Klerk, under increased pressure, began dismantling the repressive laws, and he freed Mandela, who won an easy victory in the 1994 election, the first in which blacks were permitted to vote. The country is still scarred by decades of inequality, but as President Mandela declared, the time for the healing of the wounds has come. You see, apartheid is the African word for apartness. It was a policy that governed relations between South Africans, white minority, and the non-white majority, and sanctioned racial segregation and political and economic discrimination against non-whites. The implementation of apartheid, often called separate development, since the 1960s, was made possible through the Population Registration Act of 1950, which classified all South Africans as either Bantu, meaning all black Africans, or colored, those of mixed races, or white. A fourth category of Asian or Indian and Pakistan was later added. Racial segregation, sanctioned by law, was widely spread and practiced in South Africa before 1948. But the National Party, which gained office that year, extended the policy and gave it the name apartheid. The Group Areas Act of 1950 established residential and business sections in urban areas for each race, and members of other races were barred from living, operating businesses, or owning land in them. In practice, this act and two others, which became known collectively as the Land Acts, completed a process that had begun with similar land acts adopted in 1913 and 1936. The end result was to set aside more than 80% of South Africans' land for the white minority. To help enforce the segregation of the races and to prevent blacks from encroaching on white areas, the government strengthened the existing past laws, which required non-whites to carry documents authorizing their presence in restricted areas. Other laws forbade most social contacts between the races, authorized segregated public facilities, established separate educational standards, restricted each race to certain types of jobs, curtailed non-white labor unions, and denied non-white participation in the national government. The government of South Africa in 1990 to 1991 repealed most of the social legislation that provided the legal basis for apartheid, including the Population Registration Act. Systematic racial segregation remained deeply entrenched in South African society and continued on a de facto basis. A new constitution that enfranchised blacks and other racial groups was adopted in 1993 and took effect in 1994. All race national elections, also in 1994, produced a coalition government with a black majority led by apartheid activist Nelson Mandela, the country's first black president. Now, these developments marked the end of legislated apartheid, but not of its entrenched social and economic effects. This part of the world history must remain just that, history. Never again in our world can this kind of human degradation take place. If we as global citizens respect and acknowledge one another as human beings and having human rights, we can assure that this will never ever happen again. Like, subscribe, be a genius, think for yourself. This is a Marologic channel.